Azure API management acts as a central gateway for managing and securing APIs across your organization. To protect APIs from cyber threats, unauthorized access, and data breaches, Microsoft provides security recommendations based on the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. These best practices will help you establish a strong security posture for your API infrastructure. Let's unpack how you can maintain the network security for APIM. To maintain network security, first, you use virtual network integration for APIM. By deploying APIM inside an Azure virtual network, you can restrict API traffic and prevent unauthorized access. You have two options in this case, such as external mode and internal mode. In external mode, the API gateway is publicly accessible but can still access private backend services. In internal mode, the API gateway is only accessible within the virtual network, which prevents external exposure. Next, you secure APIs with network security groups. An NSG helps control inbound and outbound traffic at the network level. You can restrict open ports to minimize attack surface, and you can allow only specific IP addresses to access API management. Be cautious when you use NSG though. APIM requires certain ports to remain open. Blocking some ports could disrupt API operations. Next, you use private endpoints. If you cannot use VNet integration, you can still isolate API management by using private endpoints, which establish a private access point to APIM and block public exposure of APIs. And lastly, you disable public network access. For extra security, disable public access to API configuration endpoints. You can use Azure policy to enforce private API access and restrict direct access to management APIs. Let's discuss the measures that you take for APIM identity management. First, you use Entra ID authentication. Entra ID provides centralized authentication for managing API access. You should use Entra ID authentication for API consumers. You should secure the developer portal with Entra ID sign-in and implement WAT 2.0 for token-based authentication. Next, you should avoid local authentication. APIM supports local accounts, but these increase security risk. Instead, disable local authentication and enforce Entra ID authentication. And monitor API subscriptions to prevent unauthorized API access. And lastly, you use managed identities for secure API calls. To securely connect APIM to backend services, use managed identities instead of service principals. You should avoid hard-coding credentials in API configurations. And you should also enable automatic key rotation for secure access to backend services. Let's understand how you can maintain API gateway security. For maintaining API gateway security, you should deploy a web application firewall. A WAF will block malicious traffic targeting your API endpoints. You can deploy APIM behind an Azure application gateway with WAF and protect APIs from SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and other web threats. You should also restrict API calls using rate limiting and throttling. To prevent DDoS attacks and API abuse, configure rate limits and throttling policies to limit excessive API requests. Let's understand how you can maintain the data security within APIM. First, encrypt data in transit with TLS. All data flowing through APIM must be encrypted using TLS 1.2+. You should enable TLS encryption for API endpoints and use client certificates for secure API communication. You should secure API secrets with Azure Key Vault. APIM uses name values to store API keys and credentials and ensure they are stored securely. For this, you should integrate APIM with Azure Key Vault for storing API access and rotate API secrets automatically. Let's understand how you can maintain privileged access for APIM. For maintaining access, you should use role-based access control. Azure RBAC allows you to control who can access and manage APIs. Assign owner, contributor, or reader roles based on API needs and limit admin permissions to essential users only. You should also disable local admin accounts in APIM. Instead, use Entra ID accounts for API management and restrict admin access to authorized users only. Let's understand what you should do for logging and monitoring for APIM. For monitoring, you should enable API gateway logs for security monitoring. Monitoring API activity is critical to detect suspicious behavior. Enable Azure Resource Log to track API request logs, such as like a gateway logs, WebSocket connection logs, backend communication logs, and ensure that you send these logs to Microsoft Sentinel or your organization's SIEM solution for security monitoring and threat detection. You should also enable Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Defender for Cloud provides threat detection for APIs as well, and you can monitor API security risk in Defender for Cloud and receive real-time alerts for API threats and vulnerabilities. To prevent data loss, backup your API configuration. Use APIM's built-in backup features to store API configurations in Azure Storage and schedule regular backups for disaster recovery. Bottom line, in summary, for securing Azure API management, use private networks and disable public access. Enable Enter-ID authentication. Enforce API rate limiting and WAP protection to prevent DDoS and API abuse. Encrypt API traffic and secure secrets in Azure Key Vault. Use RBAC and least privilege access for API management. Monitor and detect API threats by enabling Microsoft Defender for Cloud and API gateway logs. And automate API backups to prevent API configuration loss. By following these security best practices, you can secure your APIs against cyber threats, unauthorized access, and compliance risk.